Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Jake Cowin. Jake, can you give us a little bit of a background about who you are and what you currently are working on?
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me on to firstly. So my official title is Sports Performance Officer at the Tasmanian Institute of Sport. I've held
Awesome.
that for the last 4 years. It's an intentionally vague title. Basically, I provide strength and conditioning support, sports science support, and biomechanics support for the institute. And working with a variety.
Is that a budget problem, or is that you actually like
No.
working across all of those areas?
No, well, it just so happened actually that basically a 0.5 role opened up in strength conditioning and 0.5 opened up in sports science. So rather than advertising for 2.5s, they combined it together. And then I've kind of been the jack of all, or the Jake of all trades since then. So I work across a variety of sports, which is really nice. And then just in the downtime, I'm also a PhD candidate at University of Tasmania. So just submitted my thesis.
Very good.
Early this month or early last month. So just waiting feedback on that, and
Can you tell
officially
us
I'll
a
be a
little bit
doctor.
about what the PhD was primarily focused on?
Yeah, so it was titled around theoretical and practical application of movement variability within sporting tasks. So basically taking a concept well known in the motor control space of movement variability and trying to apply that across into sports and injury performance realms.
All right. To be annoying, what is motor control? It's one of the big things that we get very frustrated with is that it gets used as a catch-all, very vague term, especially by some idiot physios that we know. They seem to think that it means a particular thing, but given someone who's just done their PhD on this, can you give us how you view the idea of motor control?
Yeah, well, I think it's basically it's trying to explain how we move and why we move the way we do. To put it simply, obviously there's a lot of brilliant minds in that space trying to exactly work out the exact brain processes that are happening, the exact the way that our movement is organized based on the information we receive from the space, from the environment. But yeah, it's kind of become this sort of term that kind of catches ecological dynamics, the psychology of movement, basically integrating all of those different elements. So I think it's an intentionally vague construct for that reason.
Yeah, on that, like, I know it's something that we speak about a lot in some of the coursework that we've put together. Some of the ideas we discuss, like I always go back to that paper. It's by, what's his name? Paul. The one from, is it VU?
Are you talking about Alessandro?
No,
No,
not
no.
Alessandro. Anyway,
I've
gone back. But essentially, the idea is, I think the thing that's interesting about this space is there seems to be a lot of people, as you said, who like to get into the theoretical. It's almost like they're in the ether and they're trying to like pull in all of these weird things. And I don't know that that's always helpful. I feel like sometimes it's a little bit of like intellectual masturbation that goes on where they're talking about these theoretical constructs on top of theoretical constructs. And what I would like, because some of the research that you've done is actually very interesting, how have you been able to boil that down to what you do in a practical setting? Because the cool thing about what you're doing is you're doing research, but you actually work in a practical setting. You're working with the Institute of Sport.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely grounds you. Like it's obviously very nice to work in the theoretical space, but what does it actually mean? And I think that's probably the biggest thing. I mean, I work with a variety of different sports here, and you can present all this research to coaches, but the number one thing they'll ask is, well, all right, what does that mean, or how are we going to use that? So I think I've very much had a lot of the coaches I've worked with in the back of my mind whilst writing my thesis and designing my studies, for that pure reason that, how do we take it back to their environments and implement it? And again, I think the theoretical space is probably a lot easier to work in some regards. That
you don't have to answer to anyone.
No, exactly. Well, we can build all these constructs and ideas, and they can make a lot of sense on paper, and trying to connect those dots there. But then when you take it into settings, and it's never, I mean, I think the a prevalent thought throughout this when we were trying to design. We went through multiple iterations of the framework we proposed, and I think it all boils down to that. You're never going to have a framework or a model that fits everything.
Can you describe a little bit of the framework that you put together?
Yeah, so essentially we did a scoping review on movement variability within sport, just as a term, and we were exploring how that term is used, how well it's defined, and the different uses of it. So I had this grandiose idea of trying to link movement variability with injury risk and stuff early in my thesis, and then as I was kind of reading through the literature, it kind of became very clear that people are talking about different things despite using the same terms. So what we tried to do was try and develop what we call a nomological framework. So basically trying to tidy up the language and tidy up the terminology used to make it clear what we're talking about and make it very specific of what is being looked at and when. So we proposed, and movement variability runs into a lot of issues there in that it is this theoretical construct, but it was also being used as an operational measure. So this thing that is directly measurable, and this thing that exists in the ether that we can't quite see, we can't quite understand. We has lots of different elements to it. So there's obviously a big gap between those two that we try to fill with some subdimensions, we call them, or some types of movement variability. So we proposed that movement variability in sport exists in basically three levels or three types. We've got outcome movement variability, which is basically if we talk about a basketball shot, for example, ball goes in the hoop or it doesn't. So you score or you don't. We've then got the strategy, which is the type of shot that you might select in a basketball shot. So is that a fadeaway? Is it a finger roll? Is it a layup? Is it a floater? All the different types of movements that you could use to achieve that outcome. And then there's execution. So within each of those types, what does your wrist angle look like? What does your elbow angle look like across multiple repetitions? How much force are you pushing through the ground? So it provides that basically three different lenses to look at to try and understand exactly how movement is different between repetitions.
Yeah, we really I really love that when I know that Sophia was explaining about this paper that you guys worked on and your work specifically, because to me it very much met with some of the ideas around the pillars for sports performance, understanding that there's a technical, tactical, physical and psychological, and to me, those strategies to me suggest are similar to the tactical aspect, and then the execution's like technical. So it made a lot of sense, I think, on a lot of levels to do it and break it down in that way. I think it gives people working in the coaching space, people working in even what we do more of, which is obviously the injury management side of things, an opportunity to look at why are we actually getting the outcome that we're getting in terms of their movement performance. Like if it's varying at the back end, is that because we've actually selected the wrong strategy to get the outcome that we wanted? Is it because they actually don't have an idea of what the execution's supposed to be? Or is it a combination of all of those things? And I think one of the interesting things working more in the sports performance side of things, and I'll probably throw this to you now, is there's always this question about if you're getting the outcome, doesn't matter what the other two factors are, right? Because it's always, you see it happen a lot where, say, someone's got a really weird, say, shooting technique, but they're very effective, and the strategy that they use is maybe different to everybody else. What's your sort of position at the moment? Are you finding that there is that? Because I think it's something in coaching that people get caught up on. It's like, well, it doesn't look right, so we need to change it. And I always get reminded of this in a more popular sense of something like Moneyball, of like, the strategy didn't make sense to anyone, but they were like, okay, these are the KPIs that are really important. Is that something that you found that is weighting on the different tiers that you used to get the outcome? And even is the outcome even the important part for, long-term success in movement capability?
Yeah, I think I'll try and answer this in two parts, I guess. The first being that movement variability's changed over the years. It used to very much be a negative term, and people would associate that with an error that needed to be fixed in movement. So a lot of coaches I've worked with have still held that sort of technical model that movement variability is something that should be avoided and needs to be eradicated, and we need this perfect replicable execution, and that's what's going to get us a perfect replicable outcome. But what we find from the research is that's not the case. They're not necessarily related whatsoever. You can have really variable outcomes with a consistent execution, or you can have really variable execution and a consistent outcome. So what we find with expert performers is that even in closed environments, but particularly in open environments, we find that you can actually maintain a better consistency in outcome with more variable strategy and execution.
And I think that's counterintuitive for a lot of people when they realize that on the surface. Like, I think that was obviously first shown in some of Bernstein's work, like with those, I don't even know what they're called, but that mapping they did where they showed like someone hitting something, I think it was with a hammer, and it showed like they followed actually quite different paths at different times, but they always were able to then still hit the same point. And as you said, experts are able to achieve the outcome even in very open environments. And for those people listening who don't really know what we mean by that is, like it might be variable weather conditions or different, surfaces, or, against different opponents, or different plays that occur in, say, a field sport where, you can't really pick what your opponent's going to do, but you're still able to actually achieve whatever task you're trying to carry out. So that, I think, is always a bit counterintuitive, because people say like, well, how did they get there with so much variability? And maybe you can explain how they do actually get there.
Yeah, well, I think it's, no two movements are ever going to be exactly the same. The analogy I always try to use is that if you imagine if we try and sign, like we write our signature, no two of our signatures are going to exactly be the same. There's always going to be little differences. There's similar features, and you can tell that it's your signature across both of them, but you're never going to be perfectly able to replicate it exactly how you did previously. And the same thing happens in sport. Movements have their own signatures, and as we do multiple iterations of a movement, we get the fatigue or the information from the previous movement. So therefore, each of those trials become dependent on what we did before and the environment and how it's changing. So we constantly end up sort of iterating our movement. And again, it's how you use that information to then provide the best possible solution for that environment. And again, you see the expert performers are able to do that quite well. Guys like Steph Curry in the NBA can make a shot from seemingly anywhere in seemingly varying amounts of sort of defensive pressure, and falling away to the left, to the right, to the fadeaway. So having all of these different options and executions and the ability to change depending on who you're matched up with is a really valuable tool. But again, it's how do you bring it back to what's the key criterion for your sport and the key thing you need. A good example is within golf. What they found is they used to very, very heavily coach the backswing and what was happening around the back of the movement. But when they actually look at expert golfers, it doesn't matter really what they do around the back end. It's what happens with the club head at impact with the ball. So as long as you end up at that point with maximal speed and maximal impact, it doesn't necessarily matter what happens around the back of the movement. And better golfers are actually more variable around the back of the movement, as long as it still comes back to that sort of central point.
It's something I think about people underestimate or don't realize the ingenuity of the human system, like the ability to create quite large variability in the strategy or the execution in order to get a similar outcome. And I think that not understanding that principle leads to some issues, at least I've seen before, with regards to developing, say, a new skill, or this idea of motor control, of trying to oversimplify and repeat a very similar reduced movement, thinking that that's going to then, well, two things. One, transfer effectively to a particular task by doing it in a constrained environment. But two, as you're highlighting here, assuming that you want consistency in the execution to achieve the same outcome, which is actually contradictory to what we understand.
Yeah, I think, again, back to sort of, I guess, your earlier point as well, is like I work with a lot of Paralympic sports. And again, when we think about trying to figure out, their movement, it doesn't quite fit, obviously, within a technical model of what we would expect due to physical limitations. But again, it's trying to give them the most amount of solutions that they can utilize with what they've got. So, it's that classic sort of we're trying to maximize what they do and make them really good at it. You can make an athlete a really good swimmer, despite the fact that they don't fit a very technical model
Oh, we just
of their
lost you
thing.
there for a moment, Jake.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying you can make an athlete a very good swimmer without necessarily having all of the physical tools to be a really good swimmer. So it's just a case of what work do they need to actually equate to that. And again, what can they actually do, and how do you maximize their potential?
Well, on that, you said, how do you maximize the potential? What strategies are you finding effective, both in your practical work and professional work, and also from the research point of view? How are you attacking this? Because obviously there's probably, off the top of my head, there's probably more ways, but there's two ways. You can either start with that technical model and then slowly branch out once you feel they've got a level of competence, or you can start with a lot of variability and then refine that down to a much smaller bandwidth of variability. Is there any evidence that one of the strategies is more effective than the other?
Yeah, I think what we see with, particularly we think about like let's say youth development sport and stuff as well. When you see a little kid trying to throw a ball, into a ring, you see they'll try every way under the sun to get it to work initially. So the variability is huge. And then what happens is they work out a solution. So, it's a bucket toss into the ring. That's how I can get the ball that high, and that's how I can get it in. So then they exploit that strategy very heavily. So they kind of go from this very wide searching for everything. They find a solution, they narrow in on it, they get very, very committed to that strategy and trying to maximize it and perfect it. And then it starts to open up again. So what I try and do in my athletes is where are they at along that journey? Are they still trying to work out what works for them, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are? I'm a big advocate of sort of sharpening the sword or making what they're good at really good, and then also trying to give them capacities to keep expanding that. So particularly in my role, a lot of the athletes we work with is in that development to elite space. So my elite athletes I'm working with, we're trying to develop more solutions, more ways of exploiting things, identifying that, right, well, their opposition can do this and I can't do that. Whereas a lot of those development athletes, they might still be at that point where they're just trying to learn to utilize what they've got really effectively. So it might just be making them really good at decelerating, or making them really good at accelerating, depending on what their strength is, so that they've got options within that strategy in itself.
Is there limitations based on, exposure or even age that you believe exist, and then potentially cuts down when you're going to explore more of this variability? Like, I know that, for instance, one of the research, I think was Knudsen, talked about, like, with learning and particularly skill acquisition, the idea of like critical periods where the neuronal development actually changes, and that's often got to do with the actual biological maturity of the brain. And then obviously there's been all the work by Gregory Meyer and Avery Feigenbaum looking at some of these sort of critical periods in terms of neuromuscular development. I believe the paper was 2011, where they showed that depending on when you expose people to neuromuscular training, pre-puberty, during puberty, or post-puberty, actually changes the amount of, or the ceiling in which they can actually get to their neuromuscular development, which does suggest that there is, at a level, some restriction based on the physical maturing of the brain itself. Because I think this goes without saying, we probably haven't said this, but most of these things are obviously being done at a central level rather than maybe at a peripheral level. There is obviously peripheral contributions and sensory organs and all that kind of thing, but it's something that at the moment I'm still like unsure of where do you place this. Is this, you go really hard with the variability with teenagers, but once they get to 22, 23, 24, and they are getting to that more elite, do you start taking some of that out because maybe they actually don't have the adaptive capacity to continue exploring some of this movement variability?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to view it as, it's a capacity. It's another layer that kind of gets laid onto your current physical capacities. So, each of us, if we think about it quite binary, each of us have, a concentric capacity. And then we've also got a concentric variability that's another layer to that capacity. Same thing with our eccentric ability, same thing with our tendon stiffness, same thing with our joint sense and proprioception. We've got this variability that's an extra dimension to what we're currently looking at. And again, it's what training are we doing to actually develop that space or that breadth as well. We can develop your proprioceptive capacity, but are we actually improving your proprioceptive variability and that other dimension? So what I'm finding with what we're looking at the moment is that it is very much a training effect. If you train someone to be more variable, they can become more variable. There's still a lot to be done in this space in terms of what's the best methods, what's the best way to assess how their variability is changing. But from an anecdotal sense, what we're seeing is that as we start to introduce that, and athletes that have a really high proficiency in certain skills, for example, netball athletes and landing and deceleration, all of their deceleration capacities and landing capacities are highly variable. And that's a protective mechanism in itself, that they can handle massive amounts of landing and deceleration loads because they can spread that impact and that load without stressing the same tissues in the same way.
We're obviously talking about this in a very positive light. Are there downsides to introducing variability training?
Well, yeah, I think there's definitely an idea of, right, well, let's throw the kitchen sink at you. And, I guess you guys have talked about it before in terms of, I'm certainly not advocating for people to jump on, Swiss balls and try and juggle and, do single leg pistol squats while you're up there, like it's, I think there's definitely a lot to be done in that space of how we actually advocate for it. But again, I'll point to someone like Tyler Yibby and Sean Mishka who have done a little bit in this space around that they developed the concept of like a movement key. So, when you're prescribing your different exercises can have different amounts of movement variability within them. So you might intentionally coach a movement that is a body weight squat with a really high variability. So you might change things up repetition to repetition in terms of their foot stance, in terms of their their arm position, or in terms of their the amount of external rotation they've got. You're sort of creating differences repetition to repetition. Whereas things like like a 1RM trap bar deadlift, you're probably not going to want a lot of variability in that because again you're focused on making sure it's a nice strong position, and as that task difficulty scales up, you're also trying to make sure that variability, you're ticking the big rocks. Whereas when it's, you're in a much more comfortable space, you can toy around with some of that exploration.
Yeah, go, Jack.
I was going to ask, the way you're describing this, one of the couple of things that stand out to me is when you're describing getting someone to do a task, and let's say it's a sport-specific task, it's really important to actually give them that freedom or autonomy to actually explore completing that task in different ways. And, you can obviously change that by changing, say, the environment, say like the size of the basketball court, if it's for basketball, or maybe altering the rules slightly, but not necessarily constraining specifically how they complete the particular task, because you want to give them that ability to develop different avenues, different pathways to achieve the outcome that they need, i.e., shoot a hoop, for instance. And the other thing, though, too, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on both of these, is when we think about developing more individual biomotor abilities. So, let's say in a gym setting, you're getting someone to do a squat, or you're teaching them how to do a snatch. One of the things that I often ask myself is when we're teaching someone a new task like that, it may not necessarily be specific to their sport. You might be getting someone to do a snatch who's a basketball player to work on building up, say, overhead stability. When that person's learning that task, do you actually want to give them some flexibility to explore how they complete the movement? Or do you want to really create significant constraints early on to make sure that they complete it in a way that you think is most efficient?
Yeah, I mean, the classic explanation is you constrain to afford. So instead of thinking about constraints as sort of limiting movement, think about them as being tools to kind of steer people to solutions that they might not necessarily have explored previously. As a default, we tend to probably relate to what we're good at, and you probably try and move in a similar manner. So particularly in a court session, or in a gym session, or wherever it is, we can design our training drills and designs more effectively to create limitations, to create movements that we want. So, if you're trying to develop someone's agility, the easiest thing to do in a court-based session is you chuck them on a really small condensed space. So, if they rely a lot on that sort of linear acceleration and their top end speed, squishing that space kind of takes that away. And it's like, right, well, how can you impact the game now? You have to find a way to maximize it. And I'm a big advocate of doing that in the gym as well. We've got a lot of basketball. Like I've worked with a high-level basketball athlete who always tends to want to move with an eccentric load. They're very good with their stretch shorten cycle, and as a result, that concentric output suffers. So a lot of the movements will put constraints around basically getting rid of that stretch shorten cycle element to stress the capacity in a certain way. So again, that's going to help things like her linear acceleration, her acceleration from a dead stop, that triple threat position. But it's a case of making sure that she can explore that space without relying on what she's already good at. So again, we're also still doing separate stuff that sharpens the sword. But, I always explain it to athletes as we're trying to sharpen the sword, but also teach you how to shoot a bow. You kind of want to have your weaknesses not be so weak, but your strengths are what make you really good and got you to this level. So we want to maximize those. And in terms of making it sport specific, we'll do a lot of that with rowing. So there's definitely, I think it probably relates back to understanding the sport and understanding how they move. And again, what are the bounds and limits that you would like to see within that to ensure that it retains specificity?
Yeah, so I think what that highlights there is for someone who has that developed neuromuscular system, we have to always understand that by default, they're going to use strategies that preference their utilization of the particular physical qualities they have. So sometimes it's about creating certain constraints or modifying certain variables to make sure they can step outside of that particular area that they will continually use to complete a particular move.
Yeah, a big win for us was with our rowing coaches. We, when I first started at the institute, we were jump testing our rowers, for S&C space. And I remember the rowing coach sort of telling me, well, they don't necessarily jump in their sport. What's the relevance of this? And athletes had kind of questioned the same thing. And it took a little bit of communication with the coach and building rapport. And eventually what we were doing was throwing IMU sensors on the rowers when they were out on the water. And essentially you can, I remember sitting down with the rowing coach and being like, right, well, I can probably draw what your boat acceleration curve looks like for this athlete based on their jump curve. And, he was like, well, I don't think you can. And eventually I proved it to him. And it was like, well, look, people move the way they move, So again, we can then we started to associate changes with, well, if we change this element of this, a squat jump curve on the force plates, which we know how to use, and we know how to make those changes, then essentially we'll see this change in the boat. And essentially what we did was we started to see those changes and those shifts. And that was kind of a, oh shit moment for the coaches to kind of be like, right, we actually have a really good understanding now of how we can make changes at particular points and particular shifts, as opposed to it being a little bit more of a big question.
I think you've highlighted something that we talk about a lot, and I don't know if you know much of my background, but I coach track, and biomechanics seems to be an area that everyone's very interested in. And I always think the biomechanical outputs of someone's performance, and particularly the outcome of that performance, is very much the skill set, and it's exactly what we're talking about here, the sensory motor capabilities and sensory motor control, as well as the actual physical capabilities that they have in their tissue. Or it could be both peripheral central systems. And you've just highlighted that, you've actually made changes to, let's say, jump capability in a setting that's not 100% contextually the same as them being in a boat with their feet strapped in and pushing. How do you therefore see that transfer occurring, where sometimes you have this issue where when you're teaching someone some sort of skill, it's either they don't understand what they're doing and you need to actually develop the motor capabilities, the coordination factors associated with that skill, And sometimes they actually just lack, the physical output features that are needed for it because they're not powerful enough or strong enough, or they have, components missing, as you mentioned before, things like the eccentric component or the stretch shorten capabilities. Do you have a bit of a process that you go through to determine, which one of those factors or both of those factors, whether they're contributing to what you're actually seeing in terms of the actual movement?
Yeah, I think I tend to take it as that sort of, the classic approach is that sort of
Sorry.
general to specific, kind of quite vague initial stuff that kind of relies on some of their strengths, and you try and blend that gap a little bit. I'm a big advocate of developing ways that can kind of expose them to what it feels like. So, um, when we run into athletes that just don't have a great eccentric ability, can we supplement using things like bands to get them used to feeling what an eccentric stimulus really is, or a fast eccentric stimulus in particular? So we've done a lot of exploring, particularly with some of the research from the force plates, around how we can actually shift and what are we actually experiencing in those phases from an acceleration perspective, from the way our center of mass moves. How can we sort of mimic those with supplemental materials such as bands, such as chains, and can we actually stress those systems in such a way that it kind of makes you have to use that system, or you have to start recruiting that system, and therefore that increases that capacity of it.
On the more skill side of things, something I've been having conversations, particularly with one of our performance staff, he's also a track athlete as well, is for athletes that do get to a point in their career where their physical capacities are actually, sometimes you actually look at them and you go, well, you don't actually need to keep working on these physical capacities. Doing so may actually end up being a waste of time. The transfer at that level is not going to be. And I'll give a silly example, but say if someone is squatting well over, say, 3 times their body weight, you going to 3.2 is a complete waste of your time and effort, and probably starting to risk injury and all that kind of stuff. When you're trying to get transfer from some of those kind of features, whether it's strength or power or elastic function, to the task, do you think that the specificity of what you're doing needs to close down, or do you think that you still need to expose them to more, variability and create enough of an open environment for them to explore that? Because I'll give you my opinion so that you can kind of you can maybe preface this, but I found that once someone gets to a certain level of proficiency, I'm finding that I'm having to actually hone that skill very, very closely, and the task that you're trying to practice has to get quite specific to what they're trying to do, because the transfer that you're trying to get from, say, the physical output to, the performance is not a big gap. And so in order to actually really get that close to what they want, you've actually got to allow them not only time, but the environment and the ecological kind of exposure is quite reduced. Now, if you tell us what you think about that, and whether maybe I'm missing the boat with not adding enough variability there.
Look, I think I see it as a breadth versus depth question, really. It's a case of what does your athlete need for their event and for their sport, and again, how much of that is built as you're trying to expand their sort of variability and their capacities and their strategies and their options, and how much of it is building that depth of, you might have the one solution, but you've got all of those different executions within it, or you've got all of those different, the different capacities in the sense that you can layer into that execution. So, it's a case of, you might just be really good at this one thing and have a billion ways of doing this one thing, or that maximizes your capacity, and therefore can you just get into situations that can exploit that. A classic example from some of the data from P3 over in the States is James Harden. His eccentric rate of force development, his eccentric ability is through the roof. He's got very he's quite average in a sense from a concentric output perspective, but eccentrically he's very, very strong. So what he does is puts himself in a lot of situations where he creates step back jumpers, and because his eccentric ability, he can stop on a dime. He can actually create space really, really effectively. And again, until someone can effectively close that space and people work out how to guard that and how to defend it, you can just keep exploiting that strategy until someone makes you change it. And it's the same thing here. And, if your concentric kick is really, really good in track, for example, then if people can't match up with you, then why wouldn't you keep exploiting that strategy? Again, that has implications for the long term of what happens when someone can beat you. There's always a bigger fish. So when someone does beat you, then what do you do? And that's when, a lot of our athletes go, my stuff doesn't work anymore. Like I have to find other ways of doing stuff.
On that note, a question I wanted to ask then is, if you think about basketball, obviously very open, wicked environment, a lot of variables that you have to take into consideration, and obviously at a subconscious level, the outcomes and the execution, the strategies you use are going to be massively varied. If you look at the other spectrum, though, like thinking of, say,
Close sports, yeah.
For John being, say, a sprint coach.
Like we know the biomechanical features that the person needs to achieve a certain performance.
And that's a question I wanted to ask, because we have a much more kind environment, so to speak, where there aren't necessarily many external variables to consider. There obviously are some when you think about things like wind conditions, track surface, things like that. But yeah, do we want actually to really refine the amount of variability that we see in, say, a sprint athlete? Because if you see too much variability in their execution,
contact time, or those are the things that I think are interesting, because Jack's picked my brain actually.
Yeah.
I was going to ask the exact question of, like, in those different environments, do we actually need different strategies to tackle this movement and skill and variability problem?
Because even if someone has, say, a particular skill, like you were mentioning before, like they've got great stretch shortening capacity, eccentric capacity, if that's a thing that's going to get them to win races, do we really care, so to speak, if they're actually quite refined and limited in the executions that they use to get that outcome?
Yeah, it's a classic thing we've battled with a lot, in terms of relating it to continuous cycle sports and those kind of things. And I think it comes back to this sort of Goldilocks principle that, what we understand from the movement variability research and space is that there is a Goldilocks sort of zone, which is this optimal amount of movement variability. And then we've got kind of the too much, where your movement is too random. It's too unpredictable. You put yourself in situations that you're not necessarily used to. You think about sprinting, for example. If you sprint with too wide of a step length, or too wide of a base of support, then you're either not going to go anywhere, or you're going to fall over. It's the same thing in terms of if we go down the other end, in terms of a really periodic or a really consistent movement variability, where you've got basically no movement variability. This would be too narrow of a stride length, or too narrow of a base of support. And again, you also risk falling over, or not being steady enough in that space. And again, not moving very fast. So it's kind of operating within this Goldilocks zone. We don't quite know where the limits of that sit. Through some different analysis techniques, we can start to tease out some stuff, but it's still very much an emerging space to try and work out exactly what is good variability and what is, in a sense, bad variability.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that? Like, what, I know it's preliminary and maybe we can't be prescriptive from that, but like, what are you actually looking at? Because that's very interesting. I agree with you. Like, I always talk to people when they ask about biomechanics about bandwidth. Like, you want some variability, and you want them to be able to play in that space. But if they get too far outside of it, whether it's, as you said, too little or too much variability, then maybe we're in trouble, and we start bringing on injury risk, or we start really affecting performance outcomes.
Yeah, I think it initially started up probably with some diving results actually as well, from springboard divers, and what they found was that increased movement variability in there actually helped with their self-efficacy. So they could actually use that for, particularly in competitions, as that sort of intrinsic learning and that intrinsic adjustment and dependency of rep to rep. So when they knew what they'd previously done, they kind of could know how to give themselves feedback, in a sense of, what, I need to do more of this next time. But again, you can only do that with more information, and you only get more information by being more variable per se. So even things like airplane pilots, so more experienced pilots will actually alternate their nose position and be much more variable in their approach coming into a runway than a beginner pilot. So a beginner pilot will basically pick their path and stick with it, whereas that actual exploration of going up and then I'm waving my hand like I'm an airplane pilot now. But as you sort of alternate up and down,
Because that's how they fly.
It's
exactly,
perfect
yeah,
example.
exactly. So, but actually alternating that nose gives you more increased information, and then what you can, it's up to you to have to know what to do with that information. But the more you can sort of gain from that, the better. So, I think that definitely comes down to being adaptable in the sense of in a race, what are my competitors doing? And again, do I have a strategy that will work better in this situation compared to another? Versus how much do I stick to my pre-allocated race plan?
Okay, here's a question for you, because do you think that that's something that as sports performance professionals or coaches that we actually need to program in, or do we just need to provide enough opportunities in different, say, conditions? Because it's one of the big bugbears that I have, and I'm sure I'm sure you probably do get exposed to some of the sprinters down there in Tassie. And some people are sooks. They won't run if it's a headwind. They won't run if it's raining. They won't do anything. They won't even train. Right? They'll go, "Oh, I'm going to go in the gym," and you go, "Well, you've actually lost a variability opportunity here, right?" And some of it is psychological, right? In the sense that some people get into this mindset that they don't want to feel, say, limitations in their performance or whatever it is, and then there are negative, I think, previous sort of held psychological coaching things of like, you need to do it because it makes you tough, which I think is a crock of shit. I think the biggest thing that you need to get out of it is being able to perform and execute in different environments actually provides, as you said, like more movement variability or opportunities and options for you if you are exposed to that, in your competition environment. So do you think that we need to specifically program those kind of things in? Like even if, say, you're in a place where the weather, you're in Perth and the weather's sunny and warm every single day of the year, basically, and, you always run with a tailwind, or do you actually, or do you need to actually go seeking out opportunities, specifically in your training, say like, no, today we're actually going to do this in this weather because of, the opportunity that provides us for this movement variability?
Yeah, I think my perspective, like my background is particularly in team sports. So it's definitely been a shift coming over to Tassie and working with a lot more individual sports. And again, that shift in mentality of, right, what do we do when things aren't optimal? And again, we see this in the research too. Like, I'll give a shout out to Sean Barris, whose previous work in this space of movement variability was around diving and springboard divers. And she was a big advocate for shifting that culture, particularly in Australian diving. For divers would balk initially on their dives, so they would basically just cancel out their dive if they didn't get a perfect takeoff in training.
Yep.
And obviously, what that does is it then shoots them in the foot for competition where you might not get a perfect takeoff. So all Sean really did was basically change that belief from the coach a little bit to say, right, well, if we can prove to you that balking isn't an advantage, then would you change your mentality? And there was a lot of sort of pushback and friction there. And again, they're not easy conversations to have, but her research showed that by basically just removing that element of doesn't have to be a perfect rep, just try and complete your dive anyway, you actually increased your scores in competition. So you actually were able to be more variable and more adaptable in competitions. But again, you only get that by actually practicing in that way. So again, it's that just specific transfer. But again, it's also fighting those beliefs and those things held by the coach. We run into things like this is a coach holding that really strict technical model of this is what an athlete should do, and they just don't have the technical capacity or the physical ability to be able to do it. And it's like, right, well, based on their body shape, that's just not going to be a doable solution. So instead, we need to maybe have them row like this. And like I said, our coaches have been really good at buying into that, but it's been lots of conversations and lots of building to get to those points.
Yeah, I think it's something that over time you have to allow the opportunity to these athletes to be able to explore this stuff, because if, as you said, if they get into the mindset of they're going to bail on every single dive just because they don't get the perfect takeoff, then that's clearly going to have an effect. It's slightly going into a different area, so if it's not something that you've necessarily thought about, I understand, but one of the things that I tend to do with, say, my competition and planning and programming is actually select competitions for different levels of stress and different levels of, say, environmental exposure, because I understand that, different things will afford different opportunities. Is that something that you think about in terms of, the skill acquisition side of things and the movement variability of saying, we're going to do a practice match where we play against this team because they've all got this kind of characteristic or they play this certain style? Like, is that something that you've been exploring at all? Because I know that I do that from a competition settings. Like, I want them to run at this venue with this sort of, I know it's going to be a tailwind, or I know the weather's going to be so really hot, or it's going to be cold, or it's going to be this, because I need some exposure to that in a much more contextual, specificity for them from a competition setting, even though I know that the ultimate performance may not be perfect. It's part of their preparation for their more important competitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big advocate of that. And like I said, for me, it's putting people into situations where they've got to deal with constraints to then afford new behaviors. So I'll even do it from things like pairing different athletes up in the gym, to have them work together or have them work against each other for different things. When it comes to court training sessions with my netball athletes, for example, it might just be steering this athlete to pair up with this person because I know this athlete's got a lot of lateral strength and this one doesn't. So, again, they're going to have to then deal with, how do I deal with someone that can get around me on a lateral movement, and then how do I have to try and figure out how to solve that? And it's sometimes tricky as a coach to sort of sit there and not say anything and let them figure it out. I think that's probably the trickiest thing I've had to learn to, instead of jumping in and trying to correct and be like, oh, well, you should position yourself here, and if you sit on this person's hip here, this will create this, or if you just did this like this, you could create this. But yeah, I'm very conscious of just letting it sit back and play out, and then again having more of those debrief situations and conversations with an athlete around, right, well, what worked, what didn't work, why do you think that worked, how do we explore things differently in that sense. And again, just giving them that freedom to try different things.
How is that being received from, say, the field sport athletes? Because I think that is the next area of, say, how sports science actually does impact, is, cueing people in the area of how they move, as well as, the actual skill set that they're actually carrying out. Is that being, absorbed in a positive manner by the athletes, going, oh, actually, I really understand what you're trying to get me to do here, whether it's a constraint sort of model or not, but they actually see that your role is trying to give them better opportunities to get the outcome that they want?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on how you preface it as well. Again, I have plenty of conversations with the athletes around, this is why what we're trying to achieve, or you're probably not going to enjoy this situation because it's not the way that you like to move, but this is why we're putting you into it. So I'm very transparent with that, and I always tell my athletes, I've got a imaginary bullshit button they can press at any point to say, why am I doing this? I don't like it, and I'll always be able to justify why they're doing what they're doing. But yeah,
how does it work in the grander context of the coaching environment? Like, is the head coach going like, Jake, piss off, like you're getting in the way? Or are they like, no, that makes sense. Like, actually, I need you to teach them how to get to that position because it's really annoying me. They can't actually have an effect on the play or whatever it is.
Oh, look, it's working with them. Again, most of the information around, what we see from a physical cap, just because they have it doesn't necessarily mean they use it. And just because they use it doesn't necessarily, they've got to have it to use it, but it's just because they have it doesn't necessarily mean they use it. So we can develop a capability in the gym, but it might not necessarily transfer to the court for whatever reason. So a lot of it has to be working quite closely in with the coach and trying to establish, what are you seeing and what do you think this person needs? And then trying to design with the coach what drills and what factors we could put in to change things. And usually it's just tweaking what they've got to say, right, well, maybe we just pair these two up instead, or, maybe we just put, we use half the court through here because then that'll stress this ability. So instead of it being like a wholesale trying to come in and, again, that's not our expertise, not our domain. It's viewing things from multiple different lenses to try and get the best outcome for your athletes.
Do you get the opportunity to actually be in the more, like training type sessions where they're on the court or whatever it is? Or are you having to sort of review that separately? Because working a little bit in the institute system, unfortunately, the resources are not unlimited. Where every sport has a dedicated person. One of the frustrations that I've had, and I've actually probably annoys people, but I say, like, you can't be involved unless you can come to every single training session. And they're like, oh, that's bullshit. And I'm like, well, not my problem. Like, I understand it's not something that you want, but you can't influence the gym if you can't be on the track because they're not separate.
Yeah.
How does that work for you at the moment?
Oh, look, I mean, I'm very blessed to be working with like the netball program here. So again, there's a court element of that, which is factored in. So again, I attend a court session with these athletes, quite frequently. But again, it's also trying to get that sources of information from all around too. And again, it's I think once you sort of show that you can have an impact in this space, then it kind of opens you up for sort of that consultancy role, almost in a sense of, right, well, this is what I want to achieve. How do you think we might go about it? And again, it's usually just tweaking designs or running your eyes over a design to kind of add that layer of context of, right, well, again, knowing the athletes from a physical capability, it's like, right, well, I think this person could exploit this person here, and again, coaches will probably understand that in a sense as well. They might not necessarily be able to put the nuance around it of, oh, this is why this person can do this better than this, or this is why this person performs better in the wet than this person. But it starts to sort of have those conversations of putting that context in and putting those layers into their program to try and create that individual specificity, which is often hard to do in like a big team environment.
Yeah. There's two areas I think we need to touch on, and we probably should ask about the injury one first. What do you see the role of movement variability and skill acquisition in injury? You obviously mentioned as part of your PhD, you sort of wanted to go down that path, but it didn't end up sort of developing exactly how you thought. What do you currently see as that involvement?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a future direction, and it's something we're definitely continue to be interested in. Again, we just kind of needed to tidy up some of the language and stuff around the terms first, so we knew what we were talking about. But I think the prospective injury, I mean, the classic being sort of predictive injury risk, but also sort of why those injuries are happening. This just provides another layer of context. So again, there's good theoretical designs of how stress and injury risk actually relate to each other. So do you have movement variability and injury risk relate to each other. So if it's that classic Goldilocks theory of, if you have too little movement variability, then what you're doing is you're stressing the same tissues in the same way in the repeated manner of repeated repetitions. So if we think about it from the context of running, you're loading the same tissue the same way every single step, then what you're going to end up doing is more of your overuse style injuries. You're going to stress the tissue. It's got only a certain capacity that it can handle before it has to start before it starts breaking
Degrading.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then on the flip side, we've also got our acute situation. So if we try something that we haven't prepared for, that we've got too much movement variability, you'll start doing stuff that you've never done before, that you've got no business doing in a sense. And this is what we tend to see. When people get fatigued, they start searching for a solution. So the classic is, we think about landing when they're absolutely cooked. From a landing perspective, you start to see more of that trunk flexion. You start to see more of that dynamic knee valgus. You start to see more of these factors that are just designed to try and reduce that force. But it's like what we call a negative biomechanical response in a sense. And again, that opens up the door for an acute injury situation.
Is that well validated in the research? Sometimes when I've looked for that theoretical link, and I think the same way, but it doesn't seem to actually play out exactly like that. And I think there's some more complicated mechanisms for the development of either acute or overuse injuries. So is that actually supported, or is it still a developing space?
It is definitely still a developing space, particularly from the overuse perspective is quite well established. The acute injury risk is a lot more emerging per se.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's just hard. I mean, again, we didn't necessarily know what we were talking about, for a long period of time in sport. So, to then do big prospective studies, you also need to then rely on people getting injured, and we know a lot around trying to reduce the amount of injuries people are getting too. So, And again, we know that injuries are multifactorial too. So I don't think we're ever going to see it clear. This is the reason that this person got injured, and I don't think that's ever the case. But I think it's a case of it's another layer to consider in their movement. We see some of the things around movement expressions changing with fatigue and certain strategies being chosen more frequently than others. And again, we can see that with some of the NBA injury cases as well. So certain movement strategies will be chosen over others. And then we end up in a situation where you can't access that strategy and an injury happens. So again, there's some good sort of anecdotal or sort of
empirical
video
kind
analysis
of
stuff
sort
of happening in that space. And again, it kind of relates back to that sort of injury risk that we see from a lack of rehab as well, or the lack of sort of specific rehab, particularly in end stage. We see that despite passing all of the tests, ACL limbs can still show asymmetries left and right between from a movement variability structure perspective. So and that makes it tricky in a sense as well, that movement variability is not something we can visibly see all the time either. Starting to understand the patterns, the underlying dynamics of what our data is probably telling us is a whole new emerging space in the sport space.
On that note, I was going to ask, are there any ways that we can clinically measure movement variability?
Yeah, so when we measure movement variability, we're talking about two different sort of ways of looking at movement variability too. So we can look at the magnitude of movement variability, which is basically like the amount of variability we would have. So across 5 repetitions, how much variability is there across those 5? So this would be your classic linear measures. So like your standard deviation, your coefficient of variation, your how similar and how different are those across each repetition. Then, which is the emerging space in sport, is this concept of nonlinear analysis, which, without getting too much into it, it's looking at similarities of patterns and the structure of the data per se, or the structure of the variability. So do the first 10 points of data in your movement line up with the next 10 points of data? How well can you predict what happens next based on what you currently know from each repetition? How well do repetitions 1, 2, and 3 dictate what happens in 4 and 5? And how much of that is shared and how much of that is unique sort of exploration of the space?
One of the things I wanted to ask you, and I'm changing topics, so if you want to answer anything just on that, because that was actually very interesting. I think there's something very special kind of happening in that space where we'll start to get a good understanding of that data. But I think it actually overlaps with an area of sports performance that I think, I don't want to get you in trouble with your colleagues, but I've been seeing the appointment of both skill acquisition and biomechanics, professionals in, say, the institutes. Do you think that they are related? And if they are, should one person actually have the skill set to be able to do both? Or are they very different roles? And do you think it's justified to have two different people doing them?
Well, it's a tricky one. I think for me, it comes down to we're probably moving away from being really niche specialists in an area. I think you kind of, as an institute, as a system, we've tried to pride ourselves on flexibility and adaptability. So there's a lot more, widespread. I guess I'm probably a good case study of that.
Generalist, yeah.
I'm I am a generalist, and I think we try to sort of, I think we kind of develop people as a generalist and then have specificity in different niches per se. So again, it's hard to find someone that fits exactly that shape. But again, I think the other element is the beauty of the institute system is that we're all on the same team in that sense, that we're all Team Australia. So the biggest thing that was a shock for me coming from pro sport, where it was well, no, this is our data and it's embargoed, and our research we don't share with anyone. And now I come to the institute system and it's just like, oh yeah, just call this person up around what they're doing with their pole vaulters, and you can have all these conversations around yep, and they'll just share their data and kind of have that conversation around, yep, this is exactly what I've done, here's my approach with it. So it's quite a different perspective that I think you can probably develop your skill set quite quickly. As long as you identify where your strengths and your weaknesses are, the institute system's quite good at trying to develop those. Make you that widespread generalist.
I'm glad you said that. I don't know if you fully answered it because I think you were sitting on the fence there with whether there's a difference between biomech stuff and skill acquisition, but I won't push it too hard. I agree with you. I think that, there probably should be some significant overlap. I don't know if, not that it has anything to do with me, but I don't know if I'm a fan of them hiring two separate people to do something that I think is so related, and there are opportunities for people maybe to expand on some of their skill sets within that space quite closely and be able to create good change for people. Yeah, I won't cause a rift in the hiring network.
I was actually just going to say too. I think one of the things that's valuable, like talking to someone like you, is you come from the perspective of being obviously both a researcher but also a coach working in the field, because I think we're in that sort of world of hyper specialization. I think particularly you see a lot of researchers who all they do is research, and so they have great depth of knowledge in that one particular field, but they don't have necessarily a good understanding of how it transfers or fits in with the bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, the classic example is like, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I think it's having the right tool set for the job and knowing where to go. So, like I said, I think, again, we're in a pretty good environment that you might be employed in across multiple roles or across multiple things that you might approach from one hat, but you also know where to look at from a different perspective. And I think we're, particularly with things like technical committees and that the Australian Sports Commission are rolling out, they're very big on trying to develop lots of different viewpoints for sort of big picture issues. So you kind of are getting that multi-lens approach that you go, oh shit, actually I hadn't considered this way, or this is the way that a sports psych is dealing with it, or this is the way that this is approached. So I think that's a really valuable tool in itself that, again, as much as we're a unit of one, or it's one person employed in this role, you've probably got about a support network of 50 to 100 odd from all different viewpoints that are more than happy to tap in and again, provide you some little critical steering here and there of what's actually, what they might be seeing that's different.
We've ticked over an hour, so we probably won't hold you much longer. But a question that we always ask people is, is there something that you are exploring? And usually it's probably something outside of, your current research that's taking your interest and sort of is asking you to explore some, new ideas in your, general life. It can be professional, but it may be actually even something outside of that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it's more me getting back into some physical activity. So I've had a few health issues over the years. So for me, it's coming back to that role of being the learner and having lots of movement variability. So I'm getting back into skateboarding after a long layoff.
Yeah.
A long layoff. And coming back to a sport from 5-6 years out of doing it at like a relatively high level, it's a very interesting experience to kind of tap into some of that motor memory, or this doesn't feel like it used to. And
has your learning and research actually influenced the way that you're approaching, or are you just having fun and playing?
Oh, look, I think I'm definitely on the, we talked around that sort of continuum. I think I'm definitely at the far left side of things at the moment, where I'm exploring every solution possible, and whatever works. But yeah, I think it's, that, once you tap into something and then exploiting it and knowing that I can do this, I can feel like I can try and do this the same way, but your feet are never going to be in exactly the same position, or, you're never going to be exactly able to replicate it. So you kind of have to have lots of different ways of solving it. So I think I'm definitely just embracing that and having fun with the process.
Is that giving you ideas? Like I find that sometimes researchers and curious people generally they'll find something where they are kind of exploring and it starts to open up ideas, and you start going, oh, actually, me playing with this makes me think about this problem that I'm facing with the athletes I'm dealing with, or with the research that I'm exploring.
Yeah, I think my background was always in the weird sports. I guess I did some martial arts tricking, I did some parkour, I did skateboarding growing up. So for me, I think it's in each of those sports, people would have like distinct styles of the way they did things. Like you would just be like, right, you could see it, as a series of dots on a computer monitor, and you'd be like, oh, that's a Ryan Sheckler kickflip. And again, you'd just be like, but why is it a Ryan Sheckler kickflip? Like, how can I tell that that's that person doing it versus someone else? And we can all do the same things, but in different ways. And that style factor is it's a big aesthetic determinant for a lot of those sports. Of right, I really like the way this person does this, and people will try and replicate that. And it's just something that's so it gets my mind ticking along of why do we end up with these different ways of doing things, and how does this person have their distinct style, despite the fact that we all try and learn the trick the same way and approach it the same way.
Well, Jake, thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'm sure at some stage we'll probably annoy you for another discussion. But thank you so much. And for anyone who's interested in looking at Jake's research, he's got some fantastic papers out. So do go exploring those.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, fellas.
Thank you very much.